today for our session of Hombres, Buscando, working with wounded men. This is the second of a three-part series presented by the National Compadres Network. The third and final part, titled What is Effective in Working with Men, will be held Monday, November 21st from 12 to 1:30 Pacific. I'm going to go ahead and insert the registration link for that session in the chat after I hand it over to the presenters. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce maestros of the National Compadres Network here with us today, Mario Ozuna-Sanchez and Jaime Molina. We really appreciate having you here today and are very eager to learn from each of you. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it to you.
Pues buenas tardes. Good afternoon to everybody who has had the opportunity to choose to want to sit with us and want to be able to be included in this important dialogue of why is it that we choose to want to be able to create spaces that honor all our community, but with a strong focus in honoring men, being able to support men and what it looks like to honor themselves, with the mindset that where you have healthy men, you have healthy women and children, that you have healthy relatives. As was mentioned, my name is Mario Ozuna-Sanchez. Aquí estoy para servir. I'm here to be of service. And I'm very thankful to help lead this dialogue with a good hermano and elder of mine, Jaime Molina. We have both been with the National Compadres Network for various years. And just real quickly for myself, it's important to acknowledge that my title is I'm the Senior Manager of Training and our national initiatives. And I've been connected to the National Compadres Network since 1999. First as a member, as a direct service provider in the community of Eastside San Jose, and working within the network to offer our training and our national work across 14 states and over 40 cities. So Jaime, if you would like to give a little introduction for yourself.
Gracias, Mario. Thank you. Good morning. Buenos días. Jaime Molina, para servirles. I live in California, and I've been fortunate enough to be connected and affiliated with National Compadres Network for a number of years. Actually, my journey started, which I'll share in depth later on today, in 1993, when I was Buscando balance, when I was a wounded person. And I'm very honored and excited to share some of the resources and teachings that we'll be covering today. I'm honored to be here with everyone. Muchas gracias.
So as our tradition, that our elders, that our abuelitos, that our familias taught us, is it's always important whenever we bring community together, whenever we show up and are present, that we first start by having an acknowledgement and a grounding. That really, it's almost a permiso of asking all of our relations, the importance and the connection of being able to really see each other, to transition fully to be present with each other, and to really acknowledge that we are all here because of all our relations, all those that have built us up, all those that have sustained us. I myself am also coming to you from Northern California, from a town called Gilroy, California, about an hour and a half south of San Francisco. And I'm blessed to be standing on Tamian Ohlone indigenous land, and very thankful for the ancestors and the stewards that still exist of the Tamian Ohlone people who have really done a lot to preserve this beautiful land and allowed us the opportunity to live and exist here. But in this grounding and in this land acknowledgement, it's important to acknowledge all the directions that surround us, to acknowledge all of our relations, as I said earlier. We believe strongly that if we're determined to end the cycles of harm to our communities, we do it by building circles. And the most important aspect of a circle is acknowledging that we each stand in the center of our own circle, of our own community. That surrounding us in each direction is a relative. It's a part of our experience and our journey that has come together to help us be who we are today. That facing the east, we acknowledge and we start there, just like the sun starts by reminding us about commitment and palabra by rising up every day. The East is the direction of the men, of the masculine energy, of all our male relatives, those who identify male, those who have really done everything possible to honor healthy values, and even those that have struggled, those who have been disconnected. We acknowledge all the men with the mindset of really helping to set a different trajectory for manhood in this new generation. To really understand that as men, how we could learn to be sacred, how we could learn to offer sacred space to others. And that by learning the beautiful teachings that our abuelitas ingrained in us, we could step forward to offer the best to our communities. And facing the opposite of that direction is the direction of the West, the direction of the feminine energy, the direction of the mujeres, of all those sacred prayer warriors that have done their best to do what they can to hold families together, that have stepped up when unfortunately men didn't have the capacity to, that have done what was necessary to nurture our homes and to nurture a lot of us when we were little boys. We thank our mothers, we thank our abuelitas, we thank our tias, we thank our partners, and we thank them for helping to us many times to see a better reflection of who we were meant to and intended to be. And that when we look at these two directions, that where it's conscious that we acknowledge the spectrum that goes between the feminine and the masculine, the relatives that carry both energies, the relatives that are fluid, the relatives that are non-binary, our LGBTQ2 spirited community, which is very sacred and very crucial in having a healthy community, that we have sacred spaces, especially as men, for us to step up and look at those relatives and say, you're sacred just the way you are, and that we honor you, and that we open a space and to always keep you home with us. Because I think oftentimes there's always been this negative, unfortunate mindset that within man, or false or toxic masculinity, that we often turn our back towards our relatives that stand within that spectrum. But as men, we're stepping up here to say, no, we see you, we embrace you, and we honor you. I think it's important to acknowledge the North, the direction of the elders and the ancestors, those that came before us, those that have walked the long walk, those that have honored the teachings, have looked at their experiences and really gathered a sense of wisdom, a sense of nurturance, a sense of compassion, because in walking that long walk, they've understood what really matters more is the relationship. What really matters more is the connection. And we thank those ancestors that really did everything possible for us to stand where we stand today. We stand on their shoulders with the mindset that their offering, their sacrifice will never go for waste. That we're thankful for everything they did in order to allow us to be where we are today. That we fulfill the dream they had, where they were dreaming a healthy, better tomorrow. And that we do everything to always honor that connection and acknowledge that they still walk with us, that they support us, that everything we do still supports them. And then facing that south direction, that direction of the children, the little ones, the real maestros, in my opinion, because they have a sense of complete love and compassion, a sense of innocence that's important to hold on to, a sense of wonder, a sense of a better tomorrow. Really, this is why we do this work, so that we could leave a better space for them, so that we could break those cycles in a way that really helps no longer transfer the traumas, but transform our medicine for a better tomorrow. And that we remind ourselves that we stand in that center space. We are the center of our circle, that we ground ourselves on this earth that nourishes us, that we ground ourselves on all that she offers. You know, she's a beautiful, perfect mother, this earth, because no matter what's happened, she still gives to us. She still supports us. And that we appreciate this beautiful sky that every day reminds us every morning is a new opportunity to try again. Every morning is a new opportunity to connect, and that we could learn the teachings from yesterday to have a better today. So with that, I just want to make sure that we do those things in a good way, and that we ask that permiso, and that we make those connections, because for all of us that do this work, it's important for us to remember that it's the collective whole that really pushes us forward, and that together we can really make a better tomorrow and also support all the offering that happened yesterday. So with that note, I want to just be able to kind of bring us all, hopefully support you in allowing yourself to transition into this space as best as we can in this virtual world. But we've learned that even in a virtual world, we can still honor energy, we can still honor spirit, we can still honor the sacred. And with that, we just want to kind of remind ourselves what brought us here today. You know, when we were asked to do this webinar series, it was conscious for us to acknowledge that to really lift up what it means to have sacred manhood, at the same time means we have to be honest and reflect what has happened in our communities where that concept has been lost, where for many generations now, the opposite has existed. For many homes, for many communities, there's been a disconnect of how generational historical trauma has really created divides, has really created disconnections that have actually helped foster and support the unhealthy behaviors, the toxic masculinity that we've seen in the lives of the people we work with, in the communities that are trying to survive. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that, but with an emphasis on what has happened with the extreme, when that reality of intergenerational trauma has created really generations of incarceration, generations of violence, generations of disconnect and of unhealthy relationships. So today, Jaime and I, who both have been blessed to work in our communities and blessed to be able to support balanced communities with the focus on working with men, on the focus of working with adolescent males. And what that experience was for us, why we both chose to engage in that level of work, what our mindset was, and how we were able to do that work. I think it's important to kind of really, for us to be able to offer, and each of us are going to share a little bit of our own journeys as to why this was a part of our personal dedication and our personal mission in life. So for myself, I think it's important, you know, when I introduced myself, I said, Mario Ozuna-Sanchez para servirles. And, you know, the joke with some of my friends is, oh, Mario Ozuna-Sanchez para servirles. And they like to kind of like mock me a little bit about how I say that, but I take that very seriously because I had a man who showed me at a young age that the best thing we could do as young men and men is offer of ourselves to our families, to our communities, to everybody we engage with. My Tata Miguel said that as un hombre, you should always be ready to stand up to support others. So when I say para servirles, he was one of the few rare healthy examples I had of what it meant to be un hombre de palabra, a man of his word, a man who believed strongly that he needed to leave a better tomorrow for his grandkids, for those that he might have impacted in a negative way when he was young. And with the mindset that if we offer to each other, we can do a lot to break the chains of harm and the damage that has happened in our lives. So for me, being a young man, I started understanding why he always said, every time you introduce yourself, mijo, you say that. You want people to see you as a beacon of hope, as a beacon of, that they're surrounded with somebody who's safe and who's going to do their best they can by them. Now, the reality is my tata was one of very, very few people, or specifically men, who was emphasizing that in my life. I'm blessed that I come from a beautiful family that has had many, many blessings. But unfortunately, our earlier years of life was really surrounded with a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. I'm one of 5 children. I have 3 older brothers, and I have a younger sister. I'm a first-generation indigenous Chicano, born and raised in the community of East Los Angeles. But my parents, Margarita and Gavino Ozuna-Sanchez, were born and raised right in the border in Mexico, in a small town called Mexicali, which is right in the border of California and Baja California. My abuelos all come from the state of Sinaloa in Mexico, and I'm of indigenous Yaqui and Mayo tradition. Those are my ancestors. And for me, being first generation, we grew up in a home where in our earlier years of life, we grew up in a home where our parents were undocumented. You know, they crossed over and they had the blessing because they lived in the border where they could cross over, but unfortunately they didn't have the papers to stay. And for many years, living that life of in a home where you had to always be hidden, where you always had to ensure you didn't attract any attention to yourselves, it really did create an isolated reality where, unfortunately, allowed my dad to really live through his traumas in ways that were very unhealthy. You know, my first memory of my father, which is why this subject is so near and dear to me, was that I could remember was visiting him in jail. My earlier memories of my father were very much fueled with domestic violence, with drug addiction. He unfortunately didn't know how to live with the values that I'm blessed to now call my way of life. And because of that, my family and the trajectory of my family with my older brothers and myself was we were guided to the streets of East Los Angeles as a way of survival. So for us, living in a home where the men actually were the ones that really taught us to not trust men, to not trust any male around us, which in turn meant we never knew how to trust ourselves. While pushing forward, I actually really understood for a long time a destructive life. And at a younger age, my intervention that really supported me in navigating and wanting something different was that at a young age, I actually became a father. At the age of 15, my son, Miguel Fernando, was born. And having my son really, even though it's not the intended intervention I push for youth these days, it was what supported me in wanting to no longer have a mindset of dying for my neighborhood, but of living for my son. And what I intended to do from that day forward was to be a father for him that I never had. So fatherhood has been a part of my life now. Going on in April, it'll be 30 years. I'm blessed that from there and from navigating and I decided to not only do the best I could for my son, but I also chose to be a community worker and help other youth in the same way that I receive support. So I've been doing this work, whether directly or indirectly, with adolescent males and adult males since I was 16 years old. I'll be 45. So about 28 years now, indirectly or directly, and blessed that I'm now a husband of almost 20 years to my wife, Plaza. Have two more children, my daughter, Ileana Esperanza, and my youngest son, Alejandro Behrens. And also now a grandfather. Well, I've been a grandfather to my granddaughter, Juliana Marie, of 8 years. And for me, this is a very personal way of life. I said earlier that our hope in doing this work is to really acknowledge that where you have healthy men, you have healthy women and children. And in order to have healthy men, we needed other men to stand up and reflect that. We needed to be examples to each other. We needed to be held accountable to each other. We needed to really help us live beyond the shadow, the darkness, and even really show each other that through our own experiences and through our own realities, instead of carrying shame for what has happened to us, we could actually step up as warriors of hope to really look at those traumas and transform them into medicine and transform them into teachings to break the cycles and really offer a different way of life for the next generation of manhood. So for myself, in being blessed as I transitioned to the Bay Area to do this work, I started really initiating a lot of this work in an organization in the east side of San Jose, where everywhere I turned, I saw the effects of generational trauma, but also very importantly saw the effects of generational incarceration. it never failed that most youth I met, male, female, most communities, most families had somebody who was incarcerated, had individuals that were very important to the family structure that were not present. And many of them were behind bars or behind the bars of their mind. You know, when I looked into these communities, when I was working within these communities, I saw how much violence existed in these homes and in the streets. During those time periods, we saw how rapid teen pregnancy was. We understood the abuse of drug and alcohol and of addiction. Majority of the people, families we were working with, whenever you would ask the son, where's your dad, or where, or who do you live with, they would tell us a big chunk of them lived with their mother, or even if they live with both parents, said, I only have a connection to my mom. I don't have a relationship with my dad. You know, we saw how all these different realities were playing out in the homes. And we saw how when we would go into juvenile hall and work with a group of 30 kids, if you would ask them, how many of you have your dad at home, you would have only maybe 3 to 2 young youth in that pod that would raise their hands, where the rest of them would say, I don't know who my dad is, or my dad's locked up, or my dad left me a long time ago. And then of those 2 to 3 who would raise their hands that their dads were home, they would say, I have no connection to my dad. Every time I try to have a relationship with him, he keeps me at a distance. While we were also blessed, I would say, to be working with going into a lot of correctional facilities. And when we were working with the men on the other side, we would ask them the same question and they would respond in the same exact way. Most of them not having had relationships with their dads. Most of them projecting that fatherhood wound and passing it on to the next generation because it was instilled in them from a very young age. So to us, we saw these cycles consistently happening. And one of the things we chose to do in our community was to create a space, or to see how is it that we could support, not just because oftentimes the focus is on the adolescents or on the little kids, but we really understood that if we could work with these men, we could break generations, and we could also support the development of healthy manhood that could then come back and work within their own families and their own communities. But unfortunately, for a lot of these men that were incarcerated, it really did feel like there was a revolving door with them coming out, being home for a little bit of time, and then going back to prison. We started asking, why is it like this? And one of the biggest things we realized was the huge lack of resources for these men. There was nothing set up to support them in coming home and staying home. It felt almost like everything was set up in the opposite, to really just keep them going back in. People would often criticize these men and talk about them as being institutionalized, which was very true. But what we were saying is, how do we break those institutional chains? How is it that we support these men so that when they come home, they're actually allowed the opportunity to be home and not thinking, when am I going to go back? So at our center in the east side of San Jose, I worked for an organization called the Mexican American Community Service Agency, MACSA. We created a fatherhood group, a support network for men who were coming out of prison. We worked with these men for over 11 years in running these circles, where we created spaces that had a sense of accountability by honoring relationship, that didn't judge these men. Our mindset when they would show up is, we don't care what brought you here. We're just thankful you're here. And we're here to support you in being the best person possible to help have a sense of honoring your healing journey, to reflect it to your families, and then hopefully reflect it to your community as a whole. But one of the things we understood in this work that we were doing was that there was a really, if you're going to talk about what does it mean to be a man and how do you have a sense of healthy manhood, we had to understand how a lot of these men were raised, what were the unhealthy value systems that were imposed in them from a very young age, what were the things that were driving their energy, their decisions, and how did we have a mindset of not just saying that's bad, don't do that, but what was it that we were going to replace it with? You know, for many years, a big chunk of my work has been doing gang intervention work with young men. And one of the biggest things I've said to institutions and systems who are always saying to these kids, get out of the gang, get out of the gang. The gangs are no good. My response to those people that would push that on the youth is, but what are you going to replace it with? Because for many individuals, those unhealthy lifestyle risk factors become a way of self-identification. It becomes a way of having a sense of self-worth. And if we're not working to offer an opposite to that, a true grounded sense of that, then the truth is this is where many are going to be stuck. Many are going to be not know how to live beyond and think this is all that's set up for them. So for a lot of the men that we worked with, we understood that there was 4 driving factors that were being instilled in them from their homes, from their communities, from society. You know, a lot of these teachings, we often think, oh, we're always approaching drugs, violence. We're always approaching what I would call the symptoms, but never getting to the root causes, which we know, and through our presentations, we've spoken about our generational trauma, historical trauma, the disconnection that many people carry from existing in only a trauma-filled state. For many of us, we were disconnected from our true traditions, from our true values. We were disconnected from acknowledging who we were and acknowledging the importance of relationships. You know, a lot of the men, the things that we saw that were driving them were this concept, these 4 concepts of violence, sex, money, and control. You know, that was in many ways how they were taught and how they existed in their homes and in their communities. So even with that mindset of how they learned how to really engage with people was really that whole flight or fight mindset. They either abandoned their homes or everything was a constant battle. There was no sense of knowing how to compromise. There was no sense of knowing how to be in relationship. I mean, we teach, when we think about the concepts of even being a warrior, all we think about is this. All we think about is harm you before you harm me. Well, if we knew that this whole mindset was really being pushed on the men we were working with, we had to be conscious to understand, well, what would be the opposite of that? What is it that was really intended that our ancestors created teachings for us to live? And what we learned and what we were thankful that our elders enforced in us was that it had nothing to do with violence. It had to do with protection, a sense of honoring a healthy, safe home, where also that meant we as men didn't bring harm into our homes, that we were conscious that our choices were based on healthy connections and healthy consequences, so that we understood that though there would be times that we might have to ensure the safety of our home, even if it meant stepping in front of harm, we never were the ones responsible for bringing that harm into our home. So that as men, we understood how is it that we really did that. Because when you're truly in relation with your community and when you're truly in relation with those around you, then the reality of violence being presented to you is very little. But also being conscious that we had to understand the value of relationships. And one thing we understand about toxic masculinity is not only when it comes to sex, but also these gender roles that have been imposed in us through trauma and through colonization. You know, even to the point that we don't even know how to be in relation with others around us because of how society has created a hyper sexualized way of being in relation and connection with each other. Even men can't even hug each other without it being looked at in a certain way negatively. Of how people can be in relationship with each other without somebody feeling, what is it that you want from me? Where the reality is, the ancestors would have said it has nothing to do with sex, but it has everything to do with relationship. Honoring the relationships that you're in, honoring all your relations, and living beyond just that aspect of the physical, but acknowledging relationships that honor the whole person, the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual. That when we're in relationship with all our relatives in that sense, including the earth, including that surrounds us, we have a balanced way of acknowledging each other. Being conscious that in this world, it's not to say money's not important. And that's the first thing that was thrown at these men coming out of prison. Get a job, get money. You have to have money. But yet there was also this denial that society set up a lot of barriers and challenges for these men where they couldn't even get jobs because of their records. It was difficult for them to navigate because they didn't have cars. Some of them didn't have IDs or licenses because they owed child support from when they were incarcerated. There was so many things stacked against them. And at the same time, the only value they were being taught they could bring to the home was money, that was it. And that to me it's important for me to call out that I remember what it was like being a teen dad. And everything was being funneled towards my son's mother for support. And the only thing I was being told was, you just need to go get a job. You need to get out of school and go get a job. Being a provider definitely includes supporting the well-being of the home and the financial structure of a home. But being a provider means you also provide love. You provide nurturance. You provide a caring space. And these men, what we wanted to explain to them is the material doesn't matter. We need money to survive, but what you need more is an honorable way of life, something that offers a sense of value, some principles that really honor relationships. When you do good, when you live good, people see good in you and people understand what you're bringing to the table, especially for many men who are having to learn how to really take accountability for the relationships that they have and to understand that they have a lot of work to do to rebuild those relationships. The honor you want to build in your family, with your children, with your partner, isn't going to come from the money you bring only. It's going to come from your actions and honoring your actions that really mirror healthy value systems. So for these men to really get that, part of it was understanding this false sense of control that we're forced to have in this society. Everything has to be dominated. You would have men that would come home and their mindset was, in order to exist at home, they had to dominate. They forgot that the home existed and moved on while they were incarcerated. Many times the partner of the home was the one that was in charge and had to do double duty and do all these things. And now just because they're home, because of this false sense of manhood, there was a lot of control that they were trying to exhibit. And what we explained to them, no, what they had to learn was a sense of change, of adaptability, a sense of movement. How is it that you go with the flow? How is it that you allow yourself to be reintegrated in a respectful way into all your relationships, into all the home dynamics? So these 4 things of really having a sense of protection, having a sense of honor, having a sense of relationship, having a sense of movement, it was what the mindset that if you look at the other 4, those are all aspects of survival. And when you live with trauma, that's all you're doing is just trying to survive. But unfortunately, when you're in a survival mode, you're only thinking of yourself and you're not seeing beyond those around you. But when you see these other 4 aspects of healthy values, it's about integrating yourself as being a part of the home. Not that the home belongs to you, but you belong to the home itself. You belong to all your relations. And part of what we wanted to do in our services was really reflect that in our groups and our circles by really standing on the teachings of our ancestors. So when men would come to the group, we wanted them to feel that they were sacred. We wanted them to feel that they were wanted and welcomed. We wanted to reflect to them that they were a blessing. You got to think about it. These are the men that nobody wants around anymore. These are the throwaways. And our whole mindset was, if we want these men to reflect these values to their own families, then we had to be that example for them. Because I even remember being a young dad and trying to do my best. When I initiated my journey into fatherhood, I really had a mindset that I was going to do the opposite of what my father did, which that's a good way to start. But I really did fall on my face a lot, because in order to be a good father, I never understood I had to be a good man. And I didn't have healthy examples of manhood. So it wasn't until I connected myself with the Compadres Network, with my Maestro Jerry Theo, who's been a mentor of mine since I was 19, that I saw what healthy manhood really looked like. And in the beginning, I'm going to be real with y'all, I thought it was weird. I was like, what's wrong with these guys? And it wasn't until I was taught, this is how men really should be. Men really should be caring, nurturing, loving, honest. Men really should be honorable. And when I see these teachings of what our ancestors laid out for us, and I had men who were reflecting them to me, that was when I truly started growing. That was when I truly started learning. And when we see these teachings of offering a sense of purpose to people, offering them not just of values, but teachers that were honest, that were walking those values. Because many of us grew up with the whole mindset of do as I say, but not as I do. But very, very much struggled with people who were actually living their talk. And then also having a place that felt safe, compassionate, where people weren't judging me, but when they talked about accountability, it wasn't to punish me, but it was to remind me that because I was sacred, there was way more value in me than I ever even saw, that I could live that value, that I could have a high expectation and standard set for me, but I could have people that were going to help me achieve it. And that really when we made a commitment to live a life of healing, that then we were going to be able to truly grow and learn and develop together. But when we offered these teachings to these men, it was really important for us to be conscious to make the direct connection to their homes. That if we wanted them to understand they were sacred, they had to remember that everybody in their home was sacred. That they had a responsibility to help everybody feel wanted and connected in their home. To help everybody in their home always carry the reminder that they're a blessing. And that as men, they could also do that too. That when they understand the beauty that they see in their own children, they could help reflect to their children that each of them have a sacred purpose, that each of them have a way of being able to connect and honor others, that each of them have values that can develop that purpose, and that they could step up with the mindset that a lot of us were taught, that padres son los primeros maestros. Parents are the first teachers. They can also help teach their children, and they could help their teaching and their development. But within that, I want to be able to just pause there for a second, because I really am proud that I have my brother right here, Jaime Molina, who's going to talk to us about how to achieve these values and teachings. But first, help us also understand from a personal standpoint, what happens when you don't receive those teachings. So Jaime, la palabra te la paso.
Thank you, Mario. And I really appreciate being part of this conversation. And for you to, once again, help me remember, because one of the things that it helps us understand is to kind of create that awareness within us. Again, Jaime Molina, para servirles, My background is in clinical psychology. Actually, I work for the county. I always say, don't hold that against me, but I work for the county for in the mental health field. So my background is in mental health, substance abuse for about 30 years plus. I don't know, both personal and professional, and gang dynamics. So I'm gonna be referencing the topic as you're working with wounded men or hombres que buscan balance in a way that is both personal and professional. Because as I was listening to Mario and referencing that back to the topic, I've been very fortunate to have been able to heal and process some of the things that I myself went through. And so I hope it reflects clearly. If not, let us know. And I'll try to be um, mindful of not speaking too fast. Sometimes I get emotional and excited and I go too fast. But the idea of why people are wounded, and my experience of working in jails, juvenile halls, substance abuse centers, rehabs, and actually doing some work across the country in reforming juvenile justice. And also, unfortunately, did a personal, I did a personal um, study of the prison system for about 5 years. But as a little kid, grew up without a father figure. And I used to think that, well, that I thought that was kind of normal for fathers not to be around. But, if you think about what creates wounds, and sometimes we think that it happens when we're adults, but unfortunately it happens too often in infancy. Many of the wounded men that we meet in their 40s and 50s, well, they don't realize that they carry the pain or the abandonment issues of never knowing who the father was. I grew up in poverty, and I grew up in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and I say that as a joke. I say, it's the safest place in Mexico. And anybody who's familiar with Juarez, it's a tough place to live. But we kind of grew up in poverty, not many times not knowing where our meals were going to come from. Or my mom would say, like, we would ask, like, Mom, what are we going to have for dinner? And my mom would say, boy, I veremos, hijo. She would say, we'll see. And now I look back, well, we had no idea. And so a lot of people are wounded because even the fact that they grew up without hardly any resources. Substance abuse is, of course, is a very kind of, I don't want to say common, but something substance abuse happens. For some of us who grew up in poverty, substance abuse and the wound comes from the idea that, well, I don't have anything to put on my back for the cold. So at a young age, I think I was 7, the first time I started huffing, using uh, glue for the shoes. We call it Resistol or 5000, which was a common brand back in the 60s. And so at 7 years old, I started using inhalants to fend off the hunger and the cold. And also, I didn't realize that, but I was numbing my lack of balance, my lack of purpose, my lack of not knowing where my dad was. And my mom had to raise seven by herself, 7 of us. So a lot of things happen in infancy that lead to those wounds that later on get in the way of everyday life. The loss of innocence. I being a father of 4 girls and grandfather to 5, with my wife Ramona, who I want to acknowledge. My loss of innocence was sort of like a common thing back then, because I had a sort of like a relationship, and I was about 9, and she was 25. So you do the math, and so when a loss of innocence goes away, it never comes back. And so it's important to think about where did this happen? How did that trauma begin? And so I experienced this, but I've worked with dozens and dozens of men who sometimes too painful, too traumatic, too embarrassing, too shameful to talk about the loss of innocence. And we, as Mario pointed out, we live in a kind of sexualized reality that everything is about, oh, he's gonna have so many girlfriends and he's gonna be a stud. And we don't realize how it can traumatize a young child. Can you go on to the next slide, Mario, please? And so that was my experience. And so I want to reference it to all the men that you may be working with that have had that experience. Certainly discrimination. I came in 1971. My mom brought us to live in California. I live in Watsonville, California, near the ocean. And I experienced discrimination. There was one thing that I want to point out, that the first year, I had no idea what people were saying because I didn't speak the language. Back then, you were not allowed to speak Spanish. I mean, I wasn't. In school, they would say, Jaime, no español, because they didn't have English as second language instruction back then. So people were saying many awful things. I came in during the wetback era. And so, reference to that. And the first year, I didn't have any idea. Second year, it was different. I started picking fights because I needed to defend myself. But it was an adjustment because people that looked like me treated me like I wasn't welcome. As Marius pointed out, I wasn't a blessing to any of them. And so I thought, like, why would people treat each other like that? I was just trying to fit in. And trying to fit in is another way that people get wounded. Some of the men that we work with, and I work with in institutions, in the streets, their whole idea is, I just want to be accepted. I just want to fit in. I just want to fit into my family. But then we have all these false teachings of, in order to fit in, you got to be tough. You got to be rough. You got to be violent. You got to be, you got to be loud. And so all those things that happen can certainly create the wound that sometimes gets away. I started feeling the pressure to belong when I was 13, 14, because my background is also in soccer. I play soccer. I actually play semi-pro. So I didn't know that in order to fit in, you got to go with the flow. So at around 14 years old, I had another transition in my life. From 11 to 14, I had what we call a normal life, because when I started at 7 using drugs, then I didn't stop till I came to this country. And then I had sort of like a normalcy. And I actually remember even the trauma of having to hide myself because I had lived so much. And I realized the kids around me didn't have any of that experience, which is a blessing. But to me, it was like, I don't know anything. I had lost my innocence at a very young age. And so the pressure to belong, I had to become a little child and hide myself within them. But then I wanted to fit in, and I started adjusting and adapting to the peer pressure of smoking weed and drinking. And many times, I want to make sure I say that I miss my dad every day, and he stayed behind. And my dad, his own he was a nice guy, but he had a lot of wounds that he could never really address. And so we had to part ways, and my mom brought us because she wanted the best for us, and we had a struggle, but the emotional pain was too great. And at around 14, 15 years old, I found what we call it, like, oh, I found this great drug that makes everything disappear. And so I began to seriously engage in substance abuse, and didn't realize how it would just numb my feelings. This past weekend, I went to a funeral of a person I met. He overdosed at 40 through heroin and fentanyl. And I want to, the reason I mentioned is that it's so easy to start. And a lot of our wounded men, they have no, well, let me reference that back. Let me rephrase that a lot of the men I work with in medium security jails and in prisons and in holding programs, shelters, they've never had a conversation like the one we're having today. Nobody has ever mirrored to them that, well, it's not because of you, it's because of the emotional baggage that you carry. And in 11, we use drugs as a way to numb the pain. And so I suddenly became a master, and I don't say that with pride. I say that because I became not just good, I became a master of suppressing my feelings. But then I realized every time I came down off the drugs, the problem would still be there, if not worse. Go on to the next slide, please, Mario. And along the way, life happens, and I have been blessed because the woman in my life, my wife Ramona, I always say, well, Creator was good. Creator's always good, actually, and He blessed me with this woman that became my hero, and to this day. But along the way, I had a daughter. We had a daughter, and then we had a couple of two daughters. But I couldn't overcome my addiction and my dependence on drugs, which led to the confusion because I used to wonder, is this why I'm here in this world? And certainly I met I don't know, hundreds of men who say, well, I don't know what my purpose is. And back then I thought like, I'm only causing pain. I'm only causing pain. And my mom didn't raise me like that. So there was a lot of emotional pain, a lot of confusion as to why I was even here and why I couldn't be the man that they have a reference to. I was listening to Mario. It's like, it was hard to say, well, who's a good man? Because I had a grandfather, but he was like the respected grandfather you only look from a distance. So I had a grandfather. I didn't have a tata. I had a grandfather, which I'm honored, and he was a good man, but I would never talk. So with that confusion led to anger, led to resentment, led to wanting to numb it more. And I started losing control over my drug use, where I would actually disappear for days. Two little girls at home, and sometimes I would say, I'm not gonna go, mija. And they would cry, Daddy, you're not gonna leave again. And I would say, no, mija, I'm not gonna leave. But the loss of control led me to abandon my kids. And you see, my dad abandoned us when I was 5. And when I came to this country, I said, I will never do what my dad did to me. And here I am in my 20s doing the same thing because I couldn't control my drug use. And so my wounds were getting too heavy, and it was only creating more wounds. So I lost control of my life, but more so, I lost control of my spirit. Ended up abandoning or not walking out. I didn't abandon because I cried in even I was 3 feet off the ground. I still remember my kids. And I know for a fact, just having hundreds of conversations with men who share the same experience, we talk about how hard that was to acknowledge that we were missing our families and being kind of almost ashamed because of the pain we were causing our parents. And so in losing your spirit, you give up. And so the only way is to stay numb. And along the way, you start contemplating, and that's what it did. Well, maybe it'd be best for me to check out, for my family not to have to worry about me. So it sets off depression, anxiety, drug-induced psychosis. I mean, all the things that happen, and I thought, well, it's gonna end soon. But along the way, things happen again. Creator and the teachings that my mom had instilled in me, I just could not connect to them. Go on to the next slide, Mario. When I abandoned my family, I was about 27, 28. I ended up, using to live and living to use. It became a way of life, and I became homeless. And when we think about homeless, and now I'm working with several people that that are homeless, and not several. I'm actually the chair of a board that helps the homeless. But going to prison, it was another reality because the name I had, the name that my parents gave me, which is a whole nother story because it wasn't my dad's name, it was my mom's name, my mom's wish to be called Jaime Molina. But I lost my name. And even that in itself was such a painful thing that I was no longer Jaime Molina, I was just E9400. And it became such a painful thing. And so I experienced my life, my survival in San Quentin, where I went to processing, and I lived for about 3 years in Solano State Prison, CMF South in Vacaville. And it really changed how I see things, because I began to think like my life's over. I actually accepted the fact that as a father, one of the hardest things, and I want to share this with you, that is to acknowledge that you lost your family. The children that they're your life, you gotta accept. I certainly had to. Like let them go. They deserve somebody to take care of them. And the hardest thing for a father that I think we can relate is for me to acknowledge that they were gonna call somebody else dad. And I said, I'm gonna be there for them. I might not be in their lives, but I will be in their lives as much as I can. And I made that promise to myself that I would never do one more day that I had to, and I would never go back. And it's actually, if you look at the date, October 28, 1992, it's coming up next week. I'll be celebrating 30 years. That's my clean day, and that's also my freedom day. But it's taken a lot for me to get to this point, because in trying to fit in once again, it became a journey. And I say that I attended school and went back to work because of my wife. And I want to acknowledge what Mario said, that, my hero is my wife. She was a strong woman that never gave up on me. Even all that time I was away, she didn't give up on me. And I was actually, as hopefully none of you here in this webinar were voluntold to go to this webinar. But I was voluntold to go attend this 3-day training with Jerry Teo. That was in April 1993. And I have never looked back. It was the first time that actually I thought they're kind of telling my story, and they're talking about my journey, and I found my purpose for the first time. I created the awareness that that's my purpose, and I decided to follow this path to this day. And I want to just give back to Mario in a second, that what I want to kind of hopefully reflect back is that we need to understand what our wounded men go through. And it doesn't take away from who they are. They're still a blessing. Many of the men that I encountered in medium security prison, they just never had the confianza to sit with somebody who said, like, can you tell me about what did it start? What is it that you think about? What is the story you tell yourself every day? And building that relationship that through those ancestral teachings that Mario talked about, that's where it begins. To develop a relationship, to acknowledge people, to reflect back that they have a beautiful purpose, and there's teaching within them that will help them create the awareness and the safe space where they can begin to have a conversation, to begin to build a relationship and begin to heal. And I apologize for going fast. I just want to make sure that we cover this, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. But thank you so much for listening.
So, when we think about the wounded fathers, when we think about wounded men, especially those individuals, those communities really that we've lost to the system, doing this work in the beginning for me was at first difficult, because I was blessed that though I had a lot of experiences with trauma, I never was never physically incarcerated. I never went to prison. And for a while, I was almost like apologetic about that. I mean, like, I was almost like, I would work in the communities and I almost apologized to the guys. And then I had to realize, no, well, I was blessed. I was blessed that that wasn't my reality. But when I was working with these men and I would welcome them in, part of what I had to remind them was that I was in a different way incarcerated, because I was the son they left home. I was the little brother waiting for them to come home. I was the nephew that was learning from these men, because in my home, many times my home was the landing spot. So when my uncle would come out of prison, he'd come and stay with us. And their teachings that they were offering us, what they had, oftentimes weren't the best or healthiest. So when we work with these relatives, a big thing is to remind them that whether they were physically always home or not, that they were always still maintained a connection. They were always still a part of their families. That we weren't going to throw them away, that we were going to acknowledge their value and that they belong. Because that's one of the biggest things we realize with a lot of these brothers is many of them struggle to connect. Many of them struggle to acknowledge their emotions. They've actually only been even validated for unhealthy emotions. You know, the badder you are, the harder you are, the crazier you are, you had a sense of unhealthy respect and pride that was offered to you. Many of them lost the sense of discipline, which is learning from your mistakes, creating teaching and medicine from your mistakes, which is really what discipline is supposed to be. To be a disciple means to be a student. But all we do as a society is just punish, and with the sense of harm almost, you know. But we understand that if we want these relatives to learn from their mistakes, then we have to create safe spaces for them to really be able to talk about it, for them to be able to learn from it, for them to understand that that same issue that has in many ways harmed them for many years can also be their sense of strength, their sense of connection, their sense of offering. Because one of the blessings we understand that our grandmothers used to always teach us was that no hay mal porque bien no venga. There's nothing in this world that we can't turn into a blessing if we look at it in a different way, if we connect with it in a different way. So when we're working with these brothers, how is it that we could pass on those ancestral teachings that would really support them in no longer passing on the harm, no longer carrying on generational trauma? Many of them do it because that's all they've known. When I think about how my uncle was teaching us violence as a way of protecting ourselves, that was all he knew to offer. The reality was he cared for us and he didn't want us to have any harm. But because how he was taught to exist, he actually led through his traumas and taught us in that way. Whereas for me, my hope is that with everything that we do to the best to our, and being perfectly imperfect, because just because we choose to live with these beautiful ancestral teachings, it doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. Actually, we acknowledge that with the people we work with. We acknowledge it in a way to show them that we're still always learning. I mean, I thank Geisha so much for calling us maestros, and we appreciate that. But we're maestros because every day we're still learning. Every circle we're in, we're reflecting to everybody that we're not here to teach them. We're just here to remind them of the sacredness that they have. That as teachers, we're here to be students. We're here to continue to grow. We acknowledge that in life, our imperfections are there to guide us on how to do the best we can. So when we're offering up these spaces that are really healing centered, that are really culturally rooted, that we remind all our relations that when you're really trying to create an approach that acknowledges traumas, but with the mindset of choosing to no longer want to transfer them, we need to have a sense of acknowledgement of our own sacredness, an understanding on how our baggage and gifts impact us, a way of integrating teaching and medicine from those baggage and gifts, which means I want to choose to continue to lift up the blessings and create more blessings. And I want to learn from the baggage to ensure I don't pass it on to the next generation. And that when I do that, the movement that happens supports us in not being stuck, supports us in not being disconnected. And that really only within the circle can we do that, because yes, the effort lies within us, but it grows stronger when we do it in community, when we do it in a reflection to each other. That way we could remind ourselves of how we're truly supposed to be, by really understanding that we're a blessing and that we are a representation of transformational teachings. So really for us to really reflect to the men that we work with, the communities that we work with, that we all have the ability and responsibility to choose what we want to carry forward and leave behind what no longer supports our positive growth or purpose. So within this work, to us, we remind communities one thing before we take questions, that this is beautiful work. This is a way of life for us. But we really ask you that if you're going to open up spaces for these men, that you allow yourself to reflect these teachings even in your own life. That you really are prepared to receive these brothers and these sisters, because shouldn't only be for males, it should be for all our community. Nowadays, we have as many where the prisons are growing for women. The system is making space for our female relatives, our femme-identified relatives. And we need to be able to have somewhere to support them and reintegrating back into their homes, but that we have to be ready to receive them, and that we have to be a reflection of the teachings, because that's what the Círculo really is. It's a way of how community as a whole honors itself, honors each other, and chooses to want to have a way of being in connection with each other. So on that note, I don't know if Jaime, you wanted to add anything more before we
Yeah,
open.
thank you. Gracias, Mario. Yes, I wanted to see if I gave my train of thought that it's important to let me rephrase that. One of the ways that I found that it's really more of a natural plática is to when I show up and I work, I get to hold circle and hold space with this man and sometimes parents, is to create awareness in a way, as Mario was pointing out. Well, we can do things that we need to say, but when we do it with compassion, when we do it with respect, when we invite people and acknowledge people for showing up, for being present, we create awareness. And one thing that I found that tends to work a lot better, especially when we're reflecting back, things that we are not proud that we've done or that we carry, is to just create awareness and gently say, I'm just creating the awareness is for you to do what you think is best with that. We don't tell men how to be honorable men. We just reflect that back and we say, there's some of the things that can be part of your life because they're already in you. But the awareness part is really key. We don't tell parents how to be parents. We reflect it back in a way that it's increasing awareness, because awareness is the first step towards change. But it's something that we got to do ourselves. It's transformational. It's transforming the baggage into gifts, but it's got to be done through us. And the last part I want to say that in order to do this work, and I know I'm kind of maybe preaching to the choir here, that you got to have it to give it away. None of us can give something we don't have, and we got to acknowledge that for ourselves, because we choose to do this work, and also acknowledge that some of these men are trying to figure out how to connect to it so they can pass it on, how to connect the love and the trust. Because I was thinking about what Mario covered in the last segment, that I remember coming back home after being gone for 5 years, and actually being gone for many years physically. And because I too was out of prison, but I was a prisoner in my own mind, in my own spirit. And even knowing, even realizing I had to earn my trust to how to be a father, how to be the right father. It felt really awkward to say, Mija, don't do that. Because I thought I have no right. And so those are processes that I had to really humble myself and apply myself in a good way and earn the trust back. It wasn't there. I had to gain it back. And so I wanted to emphasize those 2 points. Gracias, Mario.
Yeah, no, and there's definitely many ways we can continue the conversation where we're talking about how is it that we recruit the men? How is it that we help them stay connected? What are the different ways of offering services? But really at this, I think part of the expansion of that is just really being prepared to receive them. I think is the first thing, and also being conscious to approach people where they're at. I think many times people think, well, I want to work with men, I want to work with these fathers, I want to work with them, but we're doing this so stuck with the mindset of a scope of work that we forget how to support and honor people and really welcome them in the beginning, really to help meet a need. Because as men, many of us were not taught to go search for help. It isn't until we have a need to fulfill that we're even going to show up. So for us, when we were working with the men in our community, we realized that majority of the men that were coming out of prison needed support with the domestic violence. They were having to meet a domestic violence part of their parole. So what we said to the parole department is send them to our group, send them to our circle, and we'll support that, but we'll also work with them on helping them understand how to be good fathers, helping them with their addiction issues, helping them with their anger, and helping them to really know what it means to be a man. Because a lot of these men never even received those basic rites of passage teachings as youngsters. Every once in a while, we would get some of the men that would come and sit in with the youth, and they would always walk away mind blown, saying to us, like, man, I wish I would have got those teachings as a young man. I wish someone would have showed me that. And not just said it, but walked with me through those teachings, walked with me through those ceremonies, walked with me to help me. So for even a lot of the men that we're working with, sometimes, we have to be conscious that we're starting at a deficit. Not that they're a deficit, but that they're starting at a deficit. And how is it that we meet them where they're at to support their need, but then also to expand to support them what the possibilities are? Because once we begin that healing journey, their possibilities are limitless. So I just want to kind of have that little bit of a touch with it, and we're more than happy to help programs that do exist on how to incorporate the teachings, how to incorporate processes, but we want to make sure that we give space for questions. I don't know how we want to do this, Keisha.
Yes, there have not been any questions added to the chat.
It can also
So
be
if
comments.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It can also be comments. There sometimes a comment list opens up for a question or a plática.
Yes, there are just 2 comments thanking you for sharing the presentation and saying how helpful it has been. And that's about all that's in the chat right now. So if anybody has a question and you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and do that, and you can ask your question, or you could place it in the chat. We still have 15 minutes. If you place your question in the chat, I will read it, and the presenters will do their best to answer.
Yeah, I think if just open up your microphone and chat.
Okay, we have Sasha saying, can you please say more about the DV program?
So we actually have, both Jaime and I have years of working with what we now call batterers intervention programs. And the reality is that many individuals who unfortunately commit domestic violence actions against their partners or family members are required, if they get incarcerated, to fulfill a domestic violence program. What we were doing, just to be a little bit specific, what we were doing was using our Hombres Buscando Valencia curriculum to support men coming out of prison. In California, there's a actual mandate that every man that comes out, or every person that comes out of prison, is required to fulfill a domestic violence program, a 52-week batterers intervention program, even if they've already finished it. Say they finished it before, caught a new case, and went to prison, they would be required as a parole condition to do it again. While one of the things that happened with a lot of the men who were trying to reintegrate home is their conditions of parole would put a lot of stipulations on them. They had to do domestic violence. They had to do drug and alcohol. They had to do anger management. They had to do parenting skills. While if you're familiar with how a lot of these services play out in communities, many of them have registration fees. Many of them have weekly fees that they have to pay. And a lot of the men would come and say, and our program, what we chose to do for this specific population was to meet that 52-week requirement and all of these additional goals, but we didn't charge them because technically the fees that they pay many times have to do with restitution. But if they already met that commitment and it's only a parole condition, then they shouldn't be having to pay. And now some people are like, well, the fees also help the programs exist. I get it. But when you're paying $40 to $30 to $50 a class every night and you have 4 classes and you're struggling to just have a job, you can't even pay the registration fees. You can't pay the weekly fees. I mean, we would have men that would say like, all of these stipulations are making me just want to not be present and making me want to just go back to prison because I can't even meet any of my requirements. So what we did as a way of supporting these men, because our goal was to keep them home, to help them stay safe, and to help them be really supportive of their families, is we offered these services and we did it for free. And what that did is it created a huge demand. We would run the groups on Tuesday nights and we would run a separate group on Thursday night. Each night we had over 50 men. Now, we don't recommend that as trainers and facilitators, but because we didn't want to have a waiting list, we would bring the men in because we knew that they needed it. And we actually had a 70% graduation rate. Now, for a whole year, think about that. We sustained these men for a year and we had a 70% graduation rate. That is huge. That is huge, especially working with men coming out of the prison system. So that just shows you how we got creative to meet their needs.
Thank you, Mario. We have another question from Abigail. It says, can you talk about how to address clients who lack accountability?
Jaime, would you like to take that one on first?
Oh, sure. Yes. The question is how to, can you repeat that?
The question is, can you talk about how to address clients who lack accountability?
Well, and well, first, when somebody doesn't see that, well, that's my fault or that's my responsibility, it's really in meeting them where they're at. As Mario was pointing out earlier, that we need to establish like a relationship so we can try to understand and build from there, because reality is that some of us may have that attitude or that perspective because that's what we know. And so we have to understand where did that come from. And as Mario pointed out, like our teachings and our philosophy is really going to the root cause of what kind of prompted us to go in that direction. So if I'm working with people or individuals who say, well, that's not me, that's on them. For me, it would be interested to understand where that mindset comes from as I began to explore and not challenge, but create awareness. You create awareness to reflect it back to what, well, if you say that you like your kids and you want to be back home with your wife, but you think that this is it. So tell me how that's going to fit in. And so we reflect that back. And again, we don't necessarily, as much as we can, don't ever say, well, this is what you should do. This is how you should see things. No, it's reflected back in a way that is respectful, that helps them look at what's coming out of their mouth and how that correlates to what the direction that they want to go. But it is a challenge, but it's a way to start. And the way you do that is con respeto y con permiso. You address that in a respectful way. And there's things that need to be said, but you always maintain the dignity of the person as you begin that relationship building process. Thank you.
I think real quickly, it's important to acknowledge based on some of the stuff we put out there. We're talking about accountability. Well, first, let's define what accountability means. Because are we talking about punishment or are we talking about connection? If we're talking about connection, and we already talked about how that looks through punishment. If we're talking about connection, accountability with connection, these are individuals many times who have never had even a sense of self-worth because of what they've experienced through their upbringing, through their connections, or through the relationships or lack thereof. So part of what we can do within a service or a program or a community is first develop accountability by honoring connection. How is it that you receive them? How is it that you acknowledge their ability to be present? How is it that you support them? How is it that when you're asking for them to talk to you about who they are, that you're really listening, that you're really acknowledging who they are and their experiences, that you're creating a space that when they show up, they could start understanding the value of relationship by how you greet them, by how you welcome them, by how you reflect to them their own sense of value so that they could then understand the value in others. A lot of these relatives have for many years never even had a sense of self-worth. So many times in the circles, that's why we talked about those ancestral teachings. If you can't even acknowledge people, how are they going to have a sense of acknowledgement and then understanding and accountability? Accountability is about mutual connection and mutual agreement, not about I'm just here to make sure you do what you have to do, but I'm here wanting the best for you. I'm here wanting to support you achieving your own goals. How is it that as a service we can do that? How is it that as a service, and then also being conscious of all the context that surrounds you? What is happening in your life? Are you even, I mean, many of these relatives are houseless. Many of these relatives are couch surfing. Many of them are struggling to eat. So even as simple as when you have a program, let's say you're doing an evening program, can you provide a small meal for them? Can you provide a space for them where maybe they could have resources that support them and receive honoring some of their other needs? So to us, accountability is about honoring the relationship to honor the community. And I think that's where we have to be conscious. Are we ready to receive these relatives? It is going to be a struggle. For many of them, they're gonna test you. For many of them, they're gonna not know how to connect to what you're offering because you're probably the first person that has legitimately given them that opportunity. So I very much think that to do that and really offer that is to reflect it and to help them understand that as much of what we're expecting of them, we're also there to offer.
Thank you. We have one more question from Paloma. It says, hello, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience. Have you engaged men who weren't fathers or partners? I feel like most of the time when I hear about programs for men and DV, it's more responsive as opposed to an invitation to be a part of this movement before harm is done.
Yes, in Santa Clara County where we live, you know, the reality is oftentimes people don't search for help or connection until there's a problem. And even what's even sad is oftentimes we can't even support people until they've been a part of the system. So part of what we acknowledge is in our process is that the círculo isn't just for those men. The circle is for all men. The circle is for all our relations. So when we're doing this work, it was like I would have some men that would reach out to me and say, "Oh, well, you know, I just want to be able to connect with my nieces and nephews. You know, or I've had this experience. We had a lot of men that were coming back as veterans, having really carrying a lot of trauma from being exposed to combat." But I'm not a father, or I'm not formerly incarcerated, and I'm like, but your community, but your familia. And really, the circle isn't intended to only just be for that population, but how is it that we have a well-rounded space that opens up for all people? And so yes, sometimes you're going to have specific needs being met in certain circles. But for us within the Compadres Network, that's why we're very big about opening healing spaces for all community and for all our relations. So we definitely believe that this isn't just, I had some people that say, well, you only do work for at-risk youth. Truth is, all kids are at risk nowadays. Truth is, all community needs support. We're all very disconnected. And if we needed something to remind us about that, that's what the pandemic did. It really did level set everybody in really as a reminder of how important relationships, connections are, and how we need to be able to reflect that and give those opportunities and spaces.
Let me,
I will, pardon, Jaime, just real quickly, I will also say that many of the men that we would bring into our fatherhood group weren't fathers yet.
Yeah.
And the mindset was, how do we prepare you for when that does happen? Or even if it never happens, for you still to step up as a healthy man, as a healthy father figure, as a healthy support to your family and your community. And we never met resistance with that.
And thank you, Mario. And I just want to emphasize that part of our approach, I live in slightly south of Santa Clara County. I live in Santa Cruz County, and this is work that we do, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz County, Monterey County, San Benito County. But we invite everyone. You know, we have other curriculums that actually have been introduced as a prevention, early intervention model. Joven Noble for the young men who are not fathers, who we hope, and this is not that we hope, but our approach is to help them be the adult that they want to be the young men that carry valores and carries palabra as they transition into being a father or a parent. You know, we offer the family strengthening model, which is cara y corazón, as a way to strengthen. And many often we say, oh, you're not here because you're not being a good parent or being a custodian, but because we want to emphasize, reaffirm what you're doing. And so it's not just about when something happened. Our approach is to honor and invite everyone from the community. And we have a girl-specific, female-specific Girasol curriculum that also addresses people who may not be parents yet as well.
There is one last question. We have 1 minute left. And it says, do you provide training to facilitators so that we can incorporate this in our groups?
So I am the senior manager of training for the National Compadres Network. I'm in charge of organizing and one of the main trainers. I want to just one more time, I'm sharing so that you could see our email address. And please reach out if you're interested in receiving training from the National Compadres Network directly on any of our curriculums and our circle process. We'll be more than happy to talk about either supporting your organization or supporting your individual training needs. Like I explained, we train throughout the country, as well as a lot of training within the state of California. Our curriculums are holistic for the whole family. All our curriculums are in English and Spanish, and we can make trainings to accommodate the needs of the community. So we have trained in English and we have trained in Spanish as well. So I'll leave that one more second up there, stop the share, and please feel free to reach out to us.
And I think that we have reached our time. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here with us today. I especially want to thank Jaime and Mario for sharing their wisdom with us today. And I hope you can all join us for the third part of this series in November. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a blessed day.